the forgotten king
We
and
ruled
queen
over the
of
islands
pre-colonial Philippines.
Long before
Before
history
Spain
forgot our
ever
names.
touched these islands, before the cross and the sword arrived
Before
on our
Spain ever
shores,
touched these islands,
there was a
gave away
king
his
who
entire
gave
kingdom
away his
for a
entire
golden hat and a
kingdom
necklace.
for a
His name
golden
is all
hat
but forgotten,
and a necklace.
lost
His
in the
name
deep
has
sweep of
almost
time.
vanished from memory.
Long before this
But his
land had a
story
name.
explains who really lived on this land before anyone called it the Philippines. His name was Marikudo. He was the chief of a dark-skinned island people called the Ati, the original inhabitants of a lush island called Panay. His wife was Maniwantiwan, remembered in old chronicles as fierce, dignified, and just as central to the decision that would define their people's fate. Together, they ruled a land of dense forests, winding rivers, and coastlines untouched by foreign flags. They answered to no emperor, no pope, no distant crown. Their authority came from the land itself and from the trust of the people who followed them through the seasons of planting, hunting, and harvest. To understand why their story matters, you have to first understand what the Philippines looked like before it was even called that. There was no single nation here. There was no unified kingdom stretching across 7,000 islands. Instead, there were hundreds of independent communities, some no bigger than a few hundred families, others sprawling into powerful trading ports that dealt with merchants from China, from Borneo, from as far as India and Arabia. Each of these communities had its own leadership, its own customs, its own gods. The islands were a mosaic of cultures, long before any outsider drew a map of them. Panay was one such island, home to the Ati people, dark-skinned, curly-haired, believed by many historians and anthropologists to be among the earliest inhabitants of the archipelago, ancestors of the broader Negrito peoples found across Southeast Asia. They were hunters and gatherers, deeply connected to the forest, moving with the rhythms of nature rather than settling into large permanent cities. Marikudo was their chief, and under his leadership, the Ati thrived on Panay's fertile lowlands and mountains for what oral tradition suggests were generations upon generations. Then, one day, according to the old chronicles, 10 Datus arrived. These were noble leaders from Borneo, fleeing not war with a foreign empire, but tyranny from within their own kingdom. Their ruler, a despot named Raja Makatunao, had grown cruel and oppressive, and rather than continue living under his rule, 10 Datus gathered their families, their followers, their belongings, and set sail across open water in search of a new home. Among them were names still remembered in fragments of Philippine oral history. Datu Puti, who led the expedition, Datu Sumakwel, known for his wisdom, Datu Bangkaya, Datu Paiburong, and others whose stories have faded into the background of a nation's collective memory. They landed on the shores of Panay, exhausted from the voyage, uncertain of what kind of welcome awaited them. What they found was a land already inhabited, governed by a king who had every right to turn them away. But Marikudo did not turn them away. Datu Puti approached him not with weapons, but with a request: land to settle on, a place to start again, far from the tyranny they had escaped. It was, in essence, one of the earliest recorded instances of what we might now call a refugee negotiation in Philippine history, migrants asking a sovereign leader for asylum, for a place to rebuild their lives. Marikudo could have refused. His people had lived on Panay for generations, hunting its forests, fishing its rivers, moving freely across land that was never fenced or claimed. He owed these strangers from Borneo nothing He could have seen them as a threat, an invading force disguised in the language of diplomacy. Many rulers throughout history, faced with foreign settlers arriving on their shores, chose exactly that path: suspicion, hostility, war. Instead, according to the old chronicles, a negotiation began, one that should change the destiny of an entire island and, in some tellings, lay a symbolic foundation stone for how peoples on these islands would come to share land with newcomers for centuries afterward. The Bornean Datus offered gifts: a long golden salakot, a traditional wide-brimmed hat, so large it could be filled to the brim with treasure, and alongside it, a beautiful necklace for Maniwantiwan, said to reach all the way down to the ground when worn around her neck. These were not small tokens. In a society without currency as we understand it today, gold and ornamentation carried enormous symbolic and material weight. They represented wealth, status, and respect, an acknowledgement that the newcomers understood exactly whose land they were asking to share. Marikudo and Maniwantiwan accepted the offer. In exchange, the lowlands of Panay, the fertile plains ideal for settlement and agriculture, were handed over to the newcomers, while the Ati people withdrew into the mountains and forests that had always been part of their world, but which now became their primary home. It's worth pausing on what this decision actually meant. It was not a surrender. It was not a conquest. It was, as far as fragmented oral history allows us to understand, a negotiated transfer, a king and queen weighing the costs and benefits of sharing their land and choosing coexistence over conflict. A great feast followed, according to tradition, the Ati and the Bornean settlers sharing food, music and dance long into the night, sealing what may be one of the earliest recorded land agreements in the archipelago's history. Drums echoed across the shoreline. Bodies painted with soot and ash moved in rhythm, a tradition some historians believe eventually gave rise to what would become the Ati-Atihan Festival, one of the oldest and most colorful celebrations in the Philippines today, a yearly tribute, whether the participants realize it or not, to that first encounter between two peoples on the shores of Panay. Here is what makes this story remarkable, regardless of how much of it survives strict historical scrutiny. This wasn't conquest. This wasn't a war. This was, as far as our fragmented history can tell us, a negotiated transfer of land between two sovereign peoples, led by a king and queen who chose diplomacy over bloodshed. Long before any Europeans set foot on these islands, Filipino ancestors were already building complex societies, negotiating treaties, exchanging gifts, and making decisions that shaped nations. And yet Marikudo and Maniwantiwan are barely remembered. Ask most people about pre-colonial Philippine rulers, and you might hear about Lapu-Lapu, the warrior of Mactan, remembered for defeating Ferdinand Magellan in battle. Rarely will you hear about the king, who gave up his lowlands peacefully, or the queen, who stood beside him at that fateful feast, wearing a necklace that touched the ground. Now, it's worth pausing here for something important, because honesty matters more than mythology. This story comes from a document called the Maragtas, written in the early 1900s by a writer named Pedro Alcantara Monteclaro, who claimed to be preserving oral traditions passed down for centuries among the peoples of Panay. Historians today are genuinely divided on how much of the Maragtas reflects authentic ancient oral tradition and how much of it may have been shaped, embellished, or even partially invented by its early 20th century author. Some believe the core narrative, the arrival of Bornean Datus, the negotiation with an indigenous ruler, the barter of land, captures a real folk memory of ancient migration and exchange, passed down through generations before finally being written down. Others argue more skeptically that the Maragtas blends genuine fragments of oral tradition with the author's own literary invention, meaning the precise details, even specific names, dates, and dialogue, may not survive rigorous historical or archaeological scrutiny. What we can say with more confidence, drawing from archaeology and broader historical study of the region, is that pre-colonial Panay, like much of the archipelago, was home to indigenous peoples, likely ancestors of today's Ati communities, who lived alongside migrating groups long before colonization ever began. Migration, trade, and cultural exchange between the islands and Borneo, and more broadly across maritime Southeast Asia, were real and ongoing processes for centuries, even if the specific personalities and precise events described in the Maragtas cannot be verified the way we might verify a modern historical record. The legend of Marikudo and Maniwantiwan endures not necessarily as verified ironclad fact, but as a powerful piece of cultural memory, a story Filipinos have chosen to keep alive because of what it represents about who they might have been and who their ancestors might have chosen to be, long before anyone else told them who they were. And what it represents matters deeply. To understand why, we have to zoom out and look at the broader world these two rulers supposedly lived in, a world that existed long before the word Philippines was ever spoken by anyone. Before Spanish ships arrived in 1521, the islands we now call the Philippines were not empty, primitive, or waiting to be discovered, as colonial narratives so often implied. They were home to sophisticated, interconnected societies. The basic political unit across much of the archipelago was something called the barangay, a word that itself comes from balangay, a type of boat used by early Austronesian settlers who migrated across the islands in waves over thousands of years. A barangay was typically a small community led by a datu, a chief who held authority over matters of law, trade, warfare, and diplomacy. Some barangays were tiny, a few dozen families, clustered along a river. Others grew into powerful trading city-states, with populations in the thousands, engaged in commerce that stretched across the entire region. Coastal settlements like Manila, then ruled by figures such as Raja Sulaiman and Raja Matanda, and Cebu, ruled by Raja Humabon, were not sleepy fishing villages. They were bustling ports, trading gold, pearls, beeswax, and forest products with merchants from China, Japan, Siam, Champa, and the Malay world. Chinese trade records from centuries before Spanish contact describe organized, prosperous communities across the islands engaging in structured commerce, complete with local currencies, weights, and measures. Some settlements, particularly in the Sulu archipelago and parts of Mindanao, had already adopted Islam by the time of Spanish arrival, forming sultanates with structured governance systems that would resist colonization for centuries longer than most of the rest of the archipelago. Women, too, held significant power in many of these pre-colonial societies, a detail often erased from simplified retellings of Philippine history. The Babaylan, spiritual leaders and healers, found across many island communities, were often women, or men who took on feminine roles, and they held enormous influence, sometimes rivaling or even exceeding that of the Datu himself in matters of spiritual guidance, medicine, and communal decision-making. Women could inherit chieftainship. Women could own property independently of their husbands. Women could initiate divorce under certain customary laws, a right that would be stripped away entirely under Spanish colonial and religious rule centuries later. Maniwantiwan, in this context, was not simply a queen standing beside her husband. She was, by all indications from the tradition, a co-ruler, a voice in the negotiation, a figure whose consent mattered as much as Marikudo's own. This is the world that produced the story of Marikudo and Maniwantiwan, a world of independent, self-governing communities, complex trade networks, spiritual traditions centered on ancestor worship and nature spirits called Anito or Diwata, and social structures that, while stratified between nobility, freemen, and enslaved or indebted classes, were nowhere near as simple or savage as colonial writers would later claim in order to justify conquest. And this is precisely why the near-total erasure of rulers like Marikudo and Maniwantiwan from popular memory matters so much. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and share and subscribe our YouTube channel for latest updates.